going to talk a little bit about other cotton wovens. And these are, some of them we've talked about before, and they don't really fit into the categories that we talked about previous, at least not always. The first is dotted Swiss or Swiss dot. Again, we talked about this in our woven section. A little bit of a choice whether to put it in the sheer or not, because it's typically semi-sheer, but doesn't necessarily have to be. Can come in opaque variations as well. And again, it's used, or it is this little dot, raised dot texture is achieved by using that special loom called a lappet loom. And we use the lappet weave to describe our dotted Swiss. Another one we talked about before, again, just little bit of review, eyelet fabric, another lappet weave. Again, probably maybe could have put it into the sheer fabric, but it's not necessarily always sheer. But it features these small little holes that are secured in the fabric. Looks like there's almost a little bit of embroidery around it, but it's not true embroidery. Again, it's used and created with the lappet weave. Can be soft to crisp, typically lightweight, and can range from opaque to sheer. And again, can come in many different varieties and patterns, sometimes resembling lace. PK. So PK is a fabric that features a texture design woven directly into the fabric. So this is achieved by using a jacquard or dobby loom, depending on the complexity of the weave. The texture is accentuated by weaving in an extra set of stuffer yarns, typically in the weft direction, and this helps create a texture. So it can be very similar to our normal dobbies or jacquards, but have more of a spongy texture to them. They're thicker, and the raised textures are much more accentuated than our typical jacquards or our dobby looms, which have jacquards aren't only slightly textured by the different types of weaves. PKs have a very pronounced raised texture. Plissé. So we'll talk a little bit more about plissé and caustic soda solution finishes when we get to our finishes section. But plissé is typically a cotton fabric and refers to a finish for the fabric. So the fabric is woven and then is treated with a caustic soda solution. Now this soda solution causes the fabric to pucker in certain locations and can be applied all over the fabric or in certain areas to create different sort of puckered textures. And here we see two. Here we see kind of a tiny little pucker in strips, and here we see a more sort of long type of a pleated pucker here. Not a true pleat, but we can sort of call this sort of plissé a little bit of a pleat as it sort of wrinkles up. As seen here in this image here, it can look a lot like seersucker. Now I'll get to seersucker in a second, but it's different because the puckers in plissé are created with this caustic soda solution and can wear out over time. Repeated washing and repeated ironing will eventually smooth out the plissé texture. So one must be careful when cleaning and treating their plissé. Sateen. Sateen is a cotton woven with a satin weave. And we talked about the satin weave, of course. Although cotton doesn't have a high natural luster, the satin weave gives this fabric a bit of a sheen, which is often exaggerated by mercerizing the cotton and using better quality fibers. This again helps with the luster of the fabric. It can also be finished with different chemicals to exaggerate that luster as well. The floats in sateen have a diagonal direction which can make it easily confused with twill. So on the weave assignment, if you guys remember, there was a satin weave. A lot of you guys mistook it for twill, and hey, that is easy to do. But that was actually a sateen. It was a cotton sateen woven again with that satin weave. And when we see that satin weave used in sateen fabrics, we do sometimes see a little bit of diagonal ribbing to it, which can be confused with twill. But how do you tell the difference? The diagonal twill is nowhere near as pronounced in a sateen as it is in our typical twills. If you move your face away from the fabric surface, it typically blends in and is no longer visible. So you don't readily see that pronounced twill. It's much harder to see. When you do move your face close, you will see a little bit of that diagonal ribbing, but it's much wider and much flatter and much less pronounced than your typical twills. You'll also see that little bit of a sheen. That will tell you that it is a sateen. Now you won't have this trouble when we move to silk satins because you won't see any sort of a diagonal ribbing at all. Here we have seersucker. So as you can tell, seersucker looks very similar to some plissé variations because it has this characteristic pucker in it. It's a lightweight cotton plain weave that is woven with yarns of varying tensions. This creates the small pucker texture in the fabric, and this is where seersucker differs from plissé. The puckers are woven in. It's a variation of weave style where we get some looser yarns and some tighter yarns, and together they create these little bumps or puckers in the fabric. Because it is woven into the fabric and not treated chemically, the puckers of seersucker will not be washed or ironed away. They will remain. Now, we typically see seersucker as having a small stripe, again, similar to the stripe thickness of gingham, where it's going to be around 1/4 of an inch or less, sometimes bigger or smaller. And you usually see them as alternating with a color and a white stripe. This is the most typical and traditional way you're going to see seersucker. However, seersucker refers to the way that it is woven. So any fabric, any cotton plain weave that is woven with varying tensions, creating puckered textures, is considered seersucker. So we can have variations of seersucker that are just one color. We can have seersuckers that are printed with different styles of stripe, so on and so forth. But again, you will typically see it in a sort of pastel, a small, thin pastel stripe alternating with a equally sized white stripe. Damask. Damask is a cotton yarn that has been woven on a jacquard loom and features the intricate patterns associated with the jacquard weaves. Sometimes jacquard and damask are used interchangeably, but typically what we'll use damask for is just to distinguish a cotton jacquard. However, you can find damasks with other fibers, just to make it super complicated. This is why a lot of times damask and jacquard are simply used interchangeably. Damasks usually come in 1 or 2 colors, but can have more. And damasks are usually also reversible, so both sides are usable patterns. damask gets its name from when it was introduced to the West from China through Damascus. Monk's cloth. Monk's cloth, other than being a great example of a basket weave, is a coarse, heavyweight fabric typically woven a little loosely with a little bit of open weave to it. So in between our bundles for the basket, our basket yarn bundles, we'll typically have a little bit of an open piece, which gives it a sort of, not fully, I would hate to call this fabric sheer, but a little bit see-through characteristic with the open, loose parts of it. But it is coarse and heavy. And typically, definitely doesn't go into our sheer category, or it isn't thought of as a sheer fabric, but makes it a little bit more breathable, considering how heavy the fabric is. Now, there are variations of monk's cloth that use other types of basket weaves, but they're always balanced basket weaves, and the most common traditional basket weave that you'll see is a 4x4 basket weave, as shown here. Again, this is when four groups, a set of 4 yarns are grouped together and follow the plain weave pattern of over, under, over, under. It is usually found unbleached and undyed, but can come in colors as well. It also has many other names, like friar's cloth, abbot's cloth, druid's cloth, bishop's cloth, so on and so forth. This concludes our section on other types of cotton weaves, cotton wovens, and we'll come back for our final section on cottons, which will feature utility cottons as well as cotton knits.